Okay, there we go. We're going to share a couple of things that we've shared in the last two sessions. One is just as we think about who we are, um, and I should be clear, I'm not sure, I'm James Puglisi. I am a white cisgendered male of privilege, a Christian privilege. Just I'm not sure, and my pronouns are he and his. Not sure if I've shared that the last two times, which is negligent on my part. But as we enter into the space tonight, just a reminder that you'll often hear the word safe space, and the reality is we're trying to create more brave space, and that I cannot necessarily make a space safer for everyone has their own experiences that hit them in different ways, and in different ways. So be mindful of that. I always think about, when my dad passed away, just seeing walnut ice cream would make me cry in a Walmart, you know. So we just don't really know what are the things that impact people. And that's just a very minor thing compared to, some of the major things that people are impacting, that are impacting them. Thinking about, the Academy Awards and how one slap, is a triggering event for a lot of people that have been victims of abuse and victims of, that type of violence. So how do you know how these things, translate in different spaces and in different people's experience? So for us, we're just talking about brave space and learning more and more about who we are and what's around us and how do we walk into places, and acknowledging that we're not perfect. None of us are perfect. We'll never, none of us will be, sadly, but that is just the nature of the game. And so how do we walk with that? How do we still move forward and not let the risk of making mistakes shut us down from acting in any kind of way whatsoever? Uh, so we have this thing in front of you, and hopefully you've had a chance to read it by now. I'm going to move on. If I can learn how to do that on this. Oh, there we are. There we go. I'm learning. So we have our community agreements, and just a reminder that we're going to ask you to stay engaged, to really be doing some deep listening, but also to be speaking up. And as you're in the act of listening, being mindful, wanting to speak up, don't let your desire to speak up impede your ability to listen. So really be thinking, and then when you have a moment, think about what it is you might want to be saying. Sometimes we start interrupting people even silently in our heads because we're trying to think of the response that we want to put out there in response to somebody. And in that case, we're really not listening. We're more concerned about what we want to say and what we want to have expressed. So just being mindful of that. Really speak from your own experience, your I statements. This is about you and how do you walk in spaces and such. Experience discomfort, be willing to do that, and sit with that. Explore that. Why are you discomfortable in a particular situation? That's something to make a note about, and something for you to go back and explore later on. Why did this particular thing make you uncomfortable all of a sudden? There's a feeling that gets expressed there that, is a clue possibly to something that's going on or something in your history and background. Expect and accept non-closure. We will not solve this tonight. If we had a way to solve this tonight, someone else smarter than me would have figured it out a long time ago. And this is really about how do we walk in community with each other. And because every day we meet a new person, that means the dynamics change with each new person that you were in conversation with. Have a curiosity to understand and not to persuade. Racialize your voice. Go for brevity. Again, this is kind of always one of my favorites. And I was at a conference the other day, and it was time for the Q&A session, and the person had to remind everybody that it was actually a question session and not a response session. Sometimes we in our we can go on and on sometimes. So really think about what it is you want to say and respect the space and respect that you're allowing space for every other voice in the room to be expressed. But say what you need to say at the same time. And then we'll honor confidentiality. And Sonia, do you have anything to say about that part?
I'll just repeat what I said last time, that obviously we're recording this, but only the public comments that Jim make or comments that I make will be shared. We're not going to share anybody. We won't share any like report backs from breakout rooms, or if we have any large group discussions, we won't be sharing individual comments on that. And remember that we're all learning. Where we are today may not be where, probably won't be where we'll be next week or next month or a year from now, whenever we come back to this recording. So just acknowledge that what people are saying is where they are at this particular time and place, and that will probably always change.
So one of the things that I continue to utilize is the agreements and this compass of how are we walking into this space tonight. And it's something where we're trying to look for balance in our lives. So think of the 4 quadrants of believing, thinking, feeling, and acting. And what we're going to do a little bit differently tonight than we did the last 2 times is we're just going to go into small little breakout rooms of about 3 people and just spend a couple minutes for you to share, instead of us having the entire group share to the entire group. They'll give us a little bit more time for some of the other things that we're going to do. But I think it's still important for us to be cognizant of how do we walk into spaces. And so be thinking about, are you in a believing space, this moral space? Are you in a thinking space where like you want information? Are you in an acting space where you're ready to go? Or are you in a feeling space where maybe you're a little scared about what's going on, or you're just not really sure, those type of things. So, and when we break you out, you're just going to share your name, what's your connection with PTA, and then briefly, where are you at in the compass today at 7 p.m. or 7:20 p.m. as it is now in this specific space? So we're really wanting to know where you're at in this very moment, not where you've been for the last month, the last 6 years or whatever, but where are you at tonight, right now, when you walk into this space? So Sonia's going to put you into into breakout rooms, and then we'll be back in about 4 minutes. So it's not going to be a long time. So be mindful of the time and share the space with each other.
Yep. So I've got all the rooms are just randomly assigned. There's no leader. You guys are just randomly sharing. There's 5 rooms. You'll have 4 minutes, and then 30 seconds will bring you back into the main space.
Thank you, everyone, for doing that. Maybe a little bit shorter, but just a chance for us to kind of be where we're at. One of the things I haven't mentioned, I first started my career out trying to break into secondary teaching and substituted for about 5 years and coached a little bit, did a couple long-term teaching positions, and I've been currently substitute teaching in the Austin School District and Leander School District for the last year. So I am somebody who actually is in the schools a little bit, not full-time, but I am in the schools even currently. So it's been an interesting return to subbing from the 1980s to the 2020s. It's a very different experience. I can tell you that. That's for another day. So one of the things about allyship that we're talking about is it's really this kind of cultural humility. It's about the intersections of how we are individually and how we operate in organizations, how we operate in the systems around us. We have a mythology in this country that, we have individualism. And the reality is none of us are individual. None of us, has made it on our own. Doesn't mean we haven't worked hard, but it doesn't mean, none of us have made it on our own. I always think of like the monastic monks that lived in caves but someone still had to bring them food, and that is community, that's relationship. So we all, if we ride our cars, we go to the store, there's a web of people that have created space for us to operate. So this sense of individualism is really a fallacy in our country. And we really are intertwined with people. And inequality, thus, it's a human generated problem. Okay, it is something that we create, and therefore it can be changed. And I encourage you all to really look into data and statistics, and really kind of begin to educate yourself about demographics and things like that. It can provide such a fascinating window into how things really are. And also a very disturbing window into how things are at the same time. And then the question is, what is the role of a service-based, communities in accountability for inequality? What is PTA's role in this? What are your schools' role in this? So those are questions that we all have to continuously ask. So when we talk about here this word allyship, ally is a verb. It's an action word. It's not a noun. Okay, so it's not an identity. We do not achieve being allies, really, in a sense, and particularly in this work. It's an ongoing thing that has ongoing development to it. So when you think of allyship, what's it look like to you? And I'll throw that question out to you real quickly, if you have any thoughts on it that you'd like to share, or even put into the chat. When you think of allyship, what's that mean to you? I'm seeing some things go into the chat. Listening, working together here. Now, just out of curiosity, can you see the little chat thing on my screen? Is that showing up on yours as well? Okay. Any other thoughts on what allyship means to somebody, or what they think it means? Standing up, standing with, and standing behind. Okay. Friendship, support, having someone you can count on. Okay. Yeah, those are all kind of good traits and good aspects. What I would say is, as we think about allyship, we're particularly in this particular discussion, we're not, we're thinking it more on an institutional level as opposed to a very individualized interpersonal level, although that's part of it. But really trying to move ourselves to think about the systems and structures and organizations and institutions that we operate in and around. So allyship is based on relationships, building trust. When you're in relationship with people, even with people you disagree with, you can have a strong relationship with somebody you disagree with, and you can trust them. And there may be times where you can work with this person on one thing, but you may be working in an opposite direction on another issue. In community organizing, they talk about no permanent friends, no permanent enemies in politics. But there is a sense that none of us will, in the most homogenistic organizations, will still have disagreements on how we want to do things and how we approach things. But when you have trust for people, you can still find ways to bridge around certain things and hold each other accountable and such. And allies in this work are people who recognize this unearned privilege that we've been talking about the last two times, white privilege that we're talking about, and things that show up with implicit bias. But it's also not just recognizing, it's taking the responsibility to think about how can those things be changed? How do we work towards something different? Allies act, and again, we said it's an action thing. They act when microaggressions are present. When there's sexual and gender harassment are present, when someone is belittled, bullied, or disrespected, just general discriminatory practices, whether they're said directly to someone or not. And anytime someone is impacted by white supremacy culture, which we talked about, and they need support or want to be supported, okay? And that want things a big question, because sometimes we want to support somebody, but they may not want our support in that moment. It may, if we act on our own understanding and not in relationship with people, we're going to talk about this a little bit more later on, but if we act without acting in community and in dialogue with the people that we're wanting to be in allyship with, we can also sometimes cause more harm, because we may be doing it the way we think it should be done and not the way that is most beneficial for that person. Or it may be just be a time to not do anything, just depending on what the situation is. So it really takes dialogue and communication. So importance of allyship is you're letting people know they're not alone, because so much of this work is people are work in isolation, particularly as a white male walking around, and when most of the people that are around me are predominantly in a white culture, because that's the setting I'm in, it can be very easy for me to forget that not everyone's experiencing that same aspect, and I think sometimes people start to realize those things when maybe they travel to another country or travel to another part of the country, where it might be a little bit different. There might be a different language spoken or whatever, and they start to get that first like little bit of an aha that my situation isn't normative as much as I think it's normative. And so being cognizant that just because you're having an experience in a space does not mean everybody else in that room or in that space is having that same experience. It's letting people know that what's happening is not acceptable, okay? And that takes an intentionality. It takes action on your part. It means you got to step out. And it's recognizing that people in impacted groups may not have power or status or opportunity, may not have the ability to influence the change that, in the spaces that they're experiencing. And what's your role in that? And it's also the recognition that people aren't free to live up to their potential. There's a big phrase in higher ed now called inclusive excellence. And it really approaches diversity not from a mindset that this is something that has to be taken care of or a problem to be dealt with, but that when we don't strive for inclusive excellence, we are cutting off the creativity and the power that diversity contributes to our communities and to our expansion of knowledge and our expansion of how the world could be. And so, we're hurting ourselves because we're denying so much knowledge and input and community and relationship. So there's a cost to not doing this stuff for everyone, not just those that are, traditionally being, marginalized. So how to be an effective ally? It's using the privilege to take on the struggle as your own. Now that word struggle always kind of worries me when, particularly as a white male, I worry when I use the word struggle, because most times for me, it's more of an inconvenience than a struggle, and I have to be mindful of the words that we use and how they may sound to different people. So those are things, I try to be cognizant of, and using it. I was in a class yesterday, and two students were talking to each other, and the one student was talking about somebody else and saying they were being very bipolar in their actions. And I had the challenge, I challenged the student about, how, be careful how you use that phrase. It's not just a general description. And that's an area that I'm having to be really attentive to. My own, a lot of the languages around disabilities, there's so many words in our practice that really impact the disability area, as well as many other areas. But it's something I know that I've been more mindful as of late, particularly as I've been dating somebody who's bipolar. So it's really had to make me very aware of how I use words and language and such. Um, it's and again, getting to the second one, learning and using inclusive language. What's the language? How do we speak? Phrases that have crept into our lexicon over the years that we're not even aware of that pop up. Do you have the ability to recognize that and then to unpack that? What kind of humility do we have in other cultural settings? I still struggle with wanting to figure out what white identity is for me when I'm around Latinx and Black communities, and where they seem to have a great culture, and I'm like, well, what's my culture? I don't know what it is anymore. And I keep turning in on myself and not experiencing the other and experiencing, what can I learn in those settings about myself and those type of things. We have to recognize who the experts are. And generally people in their communities are the experts. They know their areas, they know their situations, they know the roadblocks and impediments. So how can we be in relationship with the leaders, on a kind of very grassroots level? And being very aware of, who are the leaders and who, a lot of times the press has proclaimed leaders and they may not be the leaders, so you really have to get to know your own local community to find out who those local community leaders are and who do they look to, maybe on a more national level, just so that you're really talking to the people that are most in a position to help you, and you're in a position to walk with. Know the politics of past struggles. People, groups know their history. I was amazed. We took I used to take students to Peru from the university I worked at, and my students were always surprised at how much the students in Lima, Peru, from this small impoverished community, knew more about U.S. history than they did. They were just shocked by it. We have so much knowledge and so many lenses of history that we could look at, besides just maybe what's offered oftentimes in our schools. There are other voices, other ways to view history. You all can be, you can all participate in an event. And if you sat down and talked about how you each experienced it, you might find that you've all experienced the same event very differently. And that's kind of, expound that upon how we might look at historical events and what lenses. I think I got a really good impact of that myself when I moved to Southern California, moving from Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, and seeing Southwestern history from a more Latinx lens than from a white Eurocentric lens. Really started to challenge how I had, you looked at U.S. history. So that's part of the work of allyship, of being a good ally. Again, ask, don't make assumptions about things. We really need to learn from people. There's a sense of intersectionality when we talk about allyship. People have multiple layers of identity. Oftentimes, you may have somebody who is LGBT community. They're handicapped as well, but they may be white. You have different combinations. People bring different things. Some of it presents itself in the sense that visually you can look at somebody, and I present as white. Others present differently. So you have to be aware that there's always maybe more in a person's background than you might visually see. So how do you be sensitive to that, be aware of that, even consider it? Because that's sometimes, part of the problems we make. We just jump to assumptions about somebody based on what we just visually see, and we don't know enough about their background. And again, that gets back to the language we use. We need to be consistent on, we can't use one language in one place and think it's all right to use it in another place because, the demographics are differently there. How do we consistently talk about people and talk with people and approach people and think of people? people have different support structures as well. And knowing how to support people in those different parts of their identity, and doing it in a way where they can do it without retribution. And again, in the workplace, this becomes particularly challenging of, because oftentimes workplaces aren't, set up for that. So some places have EAP groups or I'm sorry, ERG groups, employee resource groups and things like that, that begin to help support people from different identities, but not all places have, those type of support systems, or, the leadership that gives power and ability to those particular support systems. The primary goal for white people working to understand racism and to be anti-racist is not to learn how racism impacts people of color. The primary goal is to recognize how the system of racism shapes our lives, how we uphold that system, and how we might interrupt it. So again, I'm going to ask you all, what's your reaction to that statement, particularly from who you are and what your particular identity is? It is a powerful book. It's been a controversial book, parts of the country as well. Other thoughts? Other reactions to it when you read that? Also hear words such as exhausting and defeating, sucks up time and energy.
A good question earlier in the chat before what you just read. She said, how do you disrupt without burning bridges and lose your seat at the table? That's a big discussion in our PTA.
I think it gets back to the work of, what kind of relationships are you building with people prior to the discussions, in a sense. But also, how do you start to develop the ability, and we're going to talk a little bit about this, of in a sense, turning it back to people, not in a hitting them over the head way, but when someone says something, asking about, well, what do you mean by that? I'm not quite sure what you mean by that. Could you explain that a little bit more? Or where did you hear about that? Can you tell me a little bit more about the source of things? To really try to help people draw out from their experience, because a lot of times we all have had experiences where we talk like we have authority and we know about something, but we really don't. And particularly, I think in these kind of conversations, particularly with the way the media has been, that we have some great sound bites that people just can rattle off right away. So the grace is really giving that person a chance to expand a little bit more on what they're trying to say. And sometimes that will either, you'll get clarity because maybe they're trying to say something that is not coming out well. And that's a possibility. Or sometimes they have some deep-seated, opinions, and you learn a little bit more about where they're coming from and how then can you respond. In some sense, you can trust that person more because you've learned a little bit more about who they are and and now you know a little bit more how you can respond to them. That's some of my initial thoughts to that. But you will lose people at the table, and particularly depends on what your background is too. I mean, you will sometimes be marginalized from some of these conversations. Sometimes you will lose people at the table. I think at the same time, you provides an opportunity to gain people at the table. And this work, again, is still interpersonal. It's one-on-one work, as well as, it's one-on-one work in a sense of a community. So if you get pushed out, you have to find, how do you organize other people? How do you organize other voices? Because my understanding of power is organized people and organized money. And so that's one of the ways that you may have to reclaim a seat at the table. So, when you have those large group settings, and depending on what kind of ground rules you have for your conversations in those settings, can have an impact. But you also learned a lot. You learned a lot about what are on people's minds, whether it's valid or not. But you also, now you have the opportunity to maybe go to those people and start having some, more direct conversations with them to find out more specifically about, what are their concerns, what are their fears, are they operating on misinformation or not? What could prepare them to have those conversations with their students? I think you raised that. That was one of the concerns, that they don't know how to do that. But it takes legwork, takes some of that one-on-one relationship building legwork to try to get to people. I mean, sometimes you're just not going to be able to resolve things in a large shouting match. That's just and it's really about finding ways to set up dialogue and having the first session I ever was sat in a conversation around LGBTQ questions was at a conservative Christian college. And our facilitator, before we even started talking about the different perceptions of the LGBT community, in this case, he was going from like a 6-scale developmental scale, from full acceptance to full denial. He had us sit one-on-one and talk to each other and share our first experience or our first memory encounter of somebody in our own family, our own settings around the LGBTQ questions. And for this conservative group of Christians, they all had somebody they knew, somebody in their family. And it took it from an issue to a personal human being question. And it really shaped the conversation. So how do you set up these opportunities for people to talk about these things? And it's challenging. And it takes some strategy on how to do that. That's not really an answer for you, unfortunately, as far as the situation last night. But it is, that part of the allyship is being willing to stay with that discussion and stay with that process, because you're really about protecting kids. It's for those of us that are in the more dominant position because of the identity that we're in, it's our responsibility, whether it's white supremacy and dealing with racism, or around gender, around disability, whatever. Those of us that are in positions of privilege, have a responsibility to address these systems. It should not be the responsibility of those that are experiencing those situations. It's really our responsibility to be aware and to and see where those things reveal themselves. Again, it gets back to that listening and such. So as hard as these things were last night or the night before, it also gave you material that you need to go look at and see how, what are the arguments that people are framing, and how do you respond to that? How do you, in a way that they can hear and listen. We cannot change other people. That really, so much of this is heart work, and there's only so much I can do or you can do to change somebody else's heart. And that's also a sad reality of this work. But we also can't, people change. I would not have had this conversation with you all 20 years ago. I would have been on a different place, different space. So, and I still, there are days, if you were around me enough, there are days where you would think I was still in that space because I'm still unpacking who I am and, how, things have come up in my identity. So it's, there's a thing called, I just learned about this called critical hope. It's a theory, and I just started reading about it, and it's something I want to dive into a little bit more, because it kind of gets to the, why does this matter? Why do we do this stuff? Uh, I I come from a faith perspective, and that faith perspective gives me a reason, but not everybody comes from a different value system. So what's in your value system that um, impacts how you treat people? And that's, another way to get to people is, how do they view the human person? How do they want to view the human person? Yeah. It's hard. um, that D'Angelo quote were her words an internal or an external process? Yeah, it's always a little bit of both, but uh, it's really this internal process of getting to understand ourselves. So much of being an ally is knowing ourselves. So much of being an anti-racist is knowing ourselves. So much of being, you know, uh, someone who wants to, uh, support, all the different identities that we carry, is to really get back to what of ourselves do we know? What is our own internal functioning? What are the impediments in our own knowledge of self? Well, I'm gonna move forward then, if that's all right, and I might skip a few things. But so there's prep work. You know, do you know your own biases? We've been talking about that. Do you know your own privileges? Getting to know yourself is, and that's shifting our mindset from this individual notion I mentioned earlier to that we have a multi-dimensional view of who we are. We all have multiple identities to ourselves. Being authentic about who we are. And what is this intent versus impact, which is a very important phrase, because for so many of us, particularly, we want to jump right in and start solving things, sometimes the way we think it is. And that's good intent, but it may not always have good impact. No, and that's an important one. I had a similar situation at the college I worked at in California. I was on the diversity committee, and the only sector of the campus of this community that they always talked about, the physical plant and grounds crew, was not represented on the diversity committee. And that was actually the only place on campus where there was literally any diversity. And I had to put that to the committee and to the VP and said, we're excluding part of our community here. In reality, the people in a lot of the service roles and such have more student contact than teachers do and administrators do, and they know so much about how the place operates and what's going on in students' lives. So it's such a resource to ignore, and it ignores their dignity and the dignity of the work that they bring to the educational process. So thank you for mentioning that. When I was talking about intent versus impact, I was in another discussion last week, and we were talking about racism, and one of the gentlemen was saying he was going up to people randomly on the street. He was a white older gentleman, and approaching blacks and apologizing to them about racism and such. And I'm like, oh, he thought he was doing good, and maybe in some cases he was, but he really wasn't thinking about, maybe he was triggering something for that person. Maybe that person didn't want that in that situation. It was more about what he wanted to do. He was trying to do good. He was trying to have intent, but he wasn't really cognizant of how that action might be impacting people. Do they want that in that moment? Is that where they are at? Are they ready to receive it? Does that person have the credibility to offer it? Those type of things. So this intent versus impact is a very important thing to be mindful of. So challenges is knowing what our role is, making mistakes and saying the wrong thing. And that's all, we have to do that. We have to have the courage to make mistakes. We have to have the courage to know when to step in and when to step out. One of my big practices is I'm trying to learn how to shut up, how to just keep my mouth shut when I'm in different spaces, and making sure that other voices are centered in the room besides, this white male voice. It doesn't mean I'm not engaged. I will, when I need to be engaged, I try to do that, but I also try to allow space for other voices. You have to know when people are ready to engage with you. Again, it's people's choice. People get, you don't like it when people are butting into your space. That's the same for everybody else. So we have to be cognizant of when people want to engage with us, and this, willingness to be uncomfortable. As I said, it's a discomfort for me. For others, it's way more than that. Again, I said making mistakes, being uncomfortable. I'm going to move on because of time. Whose voice is being heard in a space? We're doing things with people and not for people. Who's at the table? Who's not at the table? Who's missing? Why are they missing if they are? Being cognizant of that. And again, always decentering whiteness and whatever is takes on a normative role, even though it may not be normative. This gets a little bit to kind of what you're experiencing. Allyship is really about dialogue. Oftentimes we get caught in debates, we get caught in discussions, but we're really looking for dialogue and being able to exchange and listen to people and be listened to and discuss. And Ibu Patel says you're not in dialogue unless you're in a room with somebody you disagree with, and that's all right. That's what the nature of dialogue is. Discussions, again, this assumption, and getting back to kind of where our country looks at ourselves, we think everybody's equal, so we think our discussions are coming, everybody's coming in from an equal status, and that's not really the reality. Dialogue is listening to people to hear what their story is, and allowing them to hear your story. Performative allyship is something that's kind of something to be aware of. We had a land acknowledgement at the beginning of this, and you'll see a lot of institutions doing a land acknowledgement, and as I think they should be. But that is sometimes kind of the hot, kind of new thing to do in DEI work. And I was thinking about that. I do a land acknowledgement on the Tanaka people, but have I done a deep dive into their history, their local history? Am I in relationship with anybody in the Tanaka community here in Austin? So am I just being performative, or am I really serious about relationship building? So allyship can have that nature where it can be performative, even with good intent. So that's part of the awareness that y'all have to have. Do we just want people to think we're good people? And that's always that ongoing, thing I have to struggle with, because I want to be liked. Everyone wants to be liked. But that's not what work is really about. It's about, how do we change systems? This is a little bit back to microaggressions. As an ally, you can repeat things back to people, ask for more information about what it is they might have said. Can you elaborate on that? You can play confused. And I had to change this because when I first used this, I used the term play dumb, and getting back to disability language and such. But can you challenge stereotypes? When people are making jokes, can you challenge it? Are you willing to challenge it? And again, getting back to intent versus impact. So these are some of the things. And again, looking into some of the materials that we provided before might help give you some clues around that. I want to get to our last. Be open to listening, know what your biases are, do your own homework. So often those of us that are in the dominant, in the majority, we want somebody else to do our homework for us. We ask people, can you tell me what this is? When most of us have a phone, we have attachment to Google. We can Google a lot of things and learn a lot of things before we burden our allies to do more of the work that is really our responsibility. So I have a couple friends that I do this work with, and every time I ask them, they turn it right back on me. They know exactly when I'm taking the shortcuts, and I'm grateful to them for that. It's inner work so that you can do the outer work. So I think the last thing we're going to do, since we're at kind of near the end of our time, we're going to just do a little bit of group work. Sonia, do you think we have time to do about, well, maybe not. Actually, we're at 7:25. Let's take about 5 minutes together as a group. And these are some questions about what do you need from others to support allyship? For those of us that are seeking to be allies, what are some of the fears that we have? And I really ask you to be, and some of that's been expressed. It seems overwhelming. It's scary. Where do you start? For those of you that are seeking to work with allies, what are your hesitations? How many times have you been burnt before trying to work with allies, and those type of things? And what's the risk for your local PTA group or school system? So I'm going to throw the floor open, and some of this has actually come out already, but let's but really thinking about you personally. What do you need to be an ally, or what hinders you personally to be an ally and or to work with allies? So really kind of looking into your interior.
I'll speak for me personally. I think my biggest fear is being confronted with debate. I'm not a debater. I'm married. My husband's a debater, not me. But being confronted in a way that I don't know how to respond. You know what I mean? That I think is a personal fear of mine. So
we're at 7:29, and I want to respect the time clock. Sonia will be sending this out, this PowerPoint out to you all, and there's a lot of good resources. The thing I would just have you walk away with is this is really kind of both internal work for yourself, and then also what's the internal history of your particular organization, your particular PTA. What do you know about the PTA? What do you know about its history, its processes, its its stances around this particular area? What have been some of the difficult discussions or in the PTA about these areas? What's your history? What's your local history? What's your state history? The more knowledge you have, some of us aren't apologetics. I'm not really in apologetics either. I don't like to do argumentation. I will lose. Someone can always throw out a couple more points than I can, but it's really kind of not arguing with somebody, but drawing them out about, why do you feel this way? Well, what are the things that, lead you to believe that? Making it about what the other person thinks, trying to draw their humanity out, and allowing your humanity to come out as well. Anya, do you want to?
Yeah, do you want to just take it to the last slide?
Oh yeah, sorry. My apologies.
That's okay. Yeah, so feel free to save the chat if you want to. That's available for you, and then you can scroll to the next slide. So we are recording this, and the recording will be shared at the end of the series, but we are updating our online event page through Eventbrite with summaries of each session and links to the various resources that Jim's provided to us. So that will get updated with the third session probably sometime this week. And then you'll have a complete, at least everything that we've done so far, you'll have a one-stop shop for all those resources. And then we'll share the video recordings after the end of our session. But our last session, session 4, is going to be on Monday, April 11th. And we're going to be talking about how to build your racial biography. So that's how we'll end the series. But I sincerely want to thank everybody for attending, and I hope this time has been enlightening and thoughtful to all of you, and we wish you a good evening.